On November 12, 2025, inside the Philadelphia Mint, a Treasury official named Brandon Beach pulled a lever and struck the last penny the United States government will ever produce for circulation. It was penny number who knows what in a run that started in 1793. It cost 3.69 cents to make. It was worth one. The machine that stamped it had, by that point, been losing money on every single strike for the better part of 2 decades, and nobody in the room could tell you exactly how many billions of dollars that arithmetic had cost the country, because the number kept climbing even as the ceremony was happening. In 2023 alone, the 1-cent coin cost American taxpayers more than $179 million to manufacture. In 2015, it had cost 1.42 cents to make a coin worth 1 cent. 10 years later, that number had risen to 3.69 cents. The gap between what the coin was worth and what it cost to exist had nearly tripled, and for 232 years, the federal government kept making it anyway. This is the story of how a coin that was supposed to be the smallest, simplest unit of American money became the most expensive joke in the country's monetary history, and how the metal inside it, mined out of Montana mountains by men who never saw a penny's profit from it, left a body count that the coin itself never advertised. The story does not start in Philadelphia in 2025. It starts 6 years before there even was a United States mint, with a coin nobody was legally required to trust. In 1787, 4 years before the Constitution's federal government existed to mint anything at all, the Congress of the Confederation approved the country's first national coinage. A copper piece known today as the Fugio cent, its design inspired by Benjamin Franklin, showing a sundial under the sun and carrying the inscription, "Mind your business," while the reverse read, "United States, we are one," ringed by 13 interlocking links representing the colonies. It should have been a proud beginning. Instead, the contractor hired to strike it, a man named James Jarvis, diverted much of the copper meant for the coins into unauthorized side projects and delivered pieces lighter than promised. The public rejected them. The lesson was not lost on the framers of the actual federal government that followed. Coinage could not be handed to a private contractor and trusted to police itself. On March 1st, 1793, the newly built United States Mint delivered its first circulating coins, 11,178 copper cents, fresh off the press, authorized more than a year earlier under the Coinage Act of April 2nd, 1792, the law that Alexander Hamilton, as the country's first Treasury Secretary, had pushed through Congress to give the young republic its own currency instead of a patchwork of foreign coins, state issues, and the kind of underweight. Private coppers Jarvis had gotten away with 6 years earlier. The coin was called the chain cent, and its reverse showed 15 interlocking rings, one for each state in the Union. Americans hated it almost immediately. The chain looked less like unity and more like bondage, and newspapers of the day said so in print. The design lasted a matter of months before the mint scrapped it for a wreath, then for a woman in a liberty cap. But the coin itself, 1 cent, made of copper, minted by the federal government and nobody else, survived. It would run, in one composition or another, for the next 2 1/3 centuries. The 1792 law that created it was blunt about what it protected. Section 19 made debasing the nation's gold or silver coinage, or embezzling the metal meant for it, a capital offence for any mint officer or employee, a death sentence, on paper, for cooking the books on America's money. The penalty applied to gold and silver, not to the humble copper cent, but the message underneath it was the same for every denomination. Coinage in the United States was not a business anyone else got to run. The law stated plainly that no copper coins or pieces except the said cents and half cents would pass as legal money. Private coppers like the ones Jarvis had struck in 1787 were finished. Every coin thereafter carried a mint mark identifying which federal facility produced it, a bureaucratic fingerprint meant to make forgery and short waiting traceable in a way the Confederation-era coinage never had been. One mint, one government, one currency. That was the deal, and it held for a very long time. Counterfeiting a federal coin was, from the beginning, treated as an attack on the government itself rather than a private fraud. Later, federal statute made it a felony to strike, pass, or possess counterfeit coinage with intent to defraud, punishable by years in prison, and Treasury agents pursued small-time counterfeiters of 1-cent coins with the same legal machinery used against forgers of gold eagles. The penny was worth almost nothing on its own, but the principle behind it, that only the federal government got to decide what counted as a dollar's worth of anything, was treated as worth defending down to the last cent, literally. By the 1850s, though, the coin itself had become a problem. The original large cent was nearly the size of a modern half-dollar, heavy in the pocket and expensive to strike, and rising copper prices in the 1850s made its own metal worth almost as much as the coin. Congress acted on February 21st, 1857, when President Franklin Pierce signed a new coinage act that killed the old half-cent outright and shrank the penny down to something closer to its modern size. Mint Director James Ross Snowden pushed the change through. Chief Engraver James B. Longacre designed the new coin, a flying eagle on the front, a wreath on the back, at 88% copper and 12% nickel. Melter and refiner James Curtis Booth ran the alloy experiments that made the new metal mix actually strikeable. In 1857 alone, the Philadelphia Mint struck 17,450,000 of them, at the time the largest production run of a single coin in the country's history. On May 25, 1857, when the Mint opened windows to exchange old large cents and demonetized Spanish silver for the new coin at par, a crowd exceeding 1,000 people packed the building, lines wound around and around like the convulsions of a snake, and resellers outside promptly began flipping the new small cents to latecomers at markups of 30 to 100%. 7 years later, in 1864, the Mint changed the recipe again, dropping the nickel for a 95% copper, 5% tin and zinc bronze, the composition that would define the coin's core identity for well over a century. In 1909, on the centennial of Abraham Lincoln's birth, sculptor Victor David Brenner put the president's profile on the obverse, making it the first regularly circulating American coin to carry a real person's face instead of an allegorical figure. The federal monopoly on this small, ordinary object had, by then, survived a redesign, a shrinking, and a recipe change, and it would survive several more before it ever cracked. It finally cracked in wartime. By 1943, the US was fighting a two-ocean war, and copper was not a decorative metal anymore. It was shell casings, radio wire, and artillery fuses, and the military needed every pound of it the country could spare. The Mint could not spend that copper on pennies, so for 1 year it did not. Across Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco, the Mint struck more than 1.1 billion cents out of low-carbon steel coated in a thin layer of zinc, a silver-colored coin for the first time in the penny's history. It contained no copper at all. The zinc coating was there purely to stop the steel from rusting, and it did not do a great job. Worn steel cents turned dull grey, then rust-spotted, within a year or two of leaving a cash register. Soldiers and cashiers alike sometimes mistook the coin for a dime, since both were the wrong colour to be a penny. The experiment lasted exactly 1 year. By 1944, the Mint had gone back to copper, and the 1943 steel cent stood alone in the coin's long run as the 1 year the government could not, or would not, spend the metal that had defined the coin since 1864. It was a small crack, one bad-looking wartime year, but it proved something the Mint would rediscover 30 years later and again 40 years after that. The penny's copper was never really free. It was always a claim on something the country needed elsewhere, and when the country needed it badly enough, the coin lost. The second crack came in peacetime, and it never made it into anyone's pocket at all. By 1973, copper prices had climbed high enough that the metal inside a single bronze cent was worth almost as much as the coin's face value, and Mint engineers went looking for a cheaper substitute. They settled on a 96% aluminum alloy and struck 1,571,167 experimental blanks in anticipation of release, distributing sample coins to members of Congress and Treasury officials ahead of a formal vote. Then, 2 industries objected at once. Vending machine operators warned the lighter coin would jam their sensors, and pediatricians warned that aluminum's radio density was close enough to soft tissue that a swallowed coin would not reliably show up on a child's X-ray, unlike the denser bronze cent. A bill to authorize the aluminum cent died in committee in March 1974, and copper mining lobbyists pushed hard against it alongside the vending industry. When the government released stockpiled copper back onto the market that same year, prices fell and the economic emergency passed with it. The mint recalled every coin it had distributed and ordered the rest destroyed. Between 12 and 14 specimens were never returned. One surfaced from a former Denver Mint employee's estate decades later and was surrendered to the government only in 2016 after a legal fight. None of the aluminum cents ever entered circulation. Not one American ever spent one. The copper that filled that claim, for most of American history, came out of one town more than any other. Butte, Montana, sitting on top of what miners called the richest hill on Earth. By the early 20th century, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company controlled most of the ground under Butte, along with the newspapers, the local politicians, and, in practical terms, the price of the ore that ended up in American pennies, cartridge casings, and telephone wire. The mines ran deep, hot, and dangerous, staffed heavily by immigrant labor, Irish, Cornish, Finnish, and Eastern European men who had crossed an ocean for wages. Not for safety guarantees the company had little interest in providing. Many of the men working the deepest shafts in 1917 had been on the job only weeks, hired fast to meet wartime copper quotas, and did not yet know the mine's layout well enough to find an escape route in the dark and the smoke. On June 8, 1917, at roughly 2,500 feet below the surface of the Granite Mountain and Speculator mines, an assistant foreman named Ernest Sullau was inspecting a damaged electrical cable by carbide lamp when the oil-soaked insulation around it caught fire. The flames raced through the timber-lined shafts and consumed the oxygen underground before most men even knew there was a fire to run from. 168 miners died that night, most of them by suffocation rather than by burning, making it the deadliest hard rock mining disaster in United States history, worse than any single copper mine accident before or since. Some men survived by instinct and quick thinking rather than any safety system the company had provided, because there was no alarm system to warn them. Shift boss J.D. Moore sealed himself and a group of men behind a makeshift barrier on the 2,200-foot level and waited out the smoke. A miner named Manus Duggan led a separate group in building an emergency bulkhead by hand, buying them enough clean air to survive. 25 of the 29 men who sheltered with him lived to see the surface again. Sullau himself, the man whose lamp had started it, died trying to warn other crews before the smoke reached him. Rescue crews spent days pulling bodies from the shafts, and Butte's undertakers reportedly ran out of coffins before the count was finished. Anaconda's wartime copper profits, driven by demand from cartridge and shell production alone, dwarfed anything the company spent on shoring up the mine's safety systems in the years leading up to the fire. The mine disaster did what safety complaints alone had failed to do for years. It organized the workforce. The Metal Mine Workers Union formed within 2 weeks of the fire, and a strike followed almost immediately, demanding safer conditions and higher wages from a company that had just killed 168 of its own men in a single night. Anaconda did not negotiate quietly. On August 1st, 1917, an Industrial Workers of the World organizer named Frank Little, who had come to Butte to support the striking miners, was dragged from his boarding house by masked men and lynched from a railroad trestle. Nobody was ever charged. The strike dragged on until December 18, 1917, and the underlying conflict between the company and its workforce did not end there. Nearly 3 years later, on April 21, 1920, company guards opened fire on a group of picketing miners on Anaconda Road, killing a miner named Tom Manning and wounding 16 others. Witnesses said the wounded had been shot in the back while trying to run. A coroner's inquest later attributed Manning's death to unknown persons. No one was ever convicted for the killing, though newspaper accounts at the time reported that a company official had privately suggested violence would help break the strike. None of it slowed copper production out of Butte for long. The mines reopened within months of the fire, staffed largely by the same immigrant labor pool, because wartime demand for copper, for shell casings, for wire, and yes, for pennies, did not pause for a funeral count. Anaconda would go on operating in Butte for decades afterward, eventually becoming one of the largest copper producers on Earth. Its name later folded into a string of corporate successors as the open-pit era of mining replaced the old underground shafts. The company was never held criminally liable for the 168 deaths in 1917, for Frank Little's lynching in August of that year, or for Tom Manning's death on Anaconda Road in 1920. This was the human cost baked into the copper supply that had, since 1864, made up 95% of every American penny, a metal pulled out of a mountain that killed 168 men in a single fire, cost an organizer his life on a railroad trestle, and put a bullet in another man's back 3 years later, all so that a coin worth 1 cent could keep being struck by. The millions, year after year, in a mint that never had to look at where the copper came from. Today, the coin's economics finally collapse under a version of the same pressure that killed the large cent in 1857 and the copper cent, briefly, in 1943. The metal becomes worth more than the money. Copper prices climbed through the late 1970s to the point where the copper content of a single cent minted before 1982 is worth more than 1 cent, and hoarders start pulling cents out of circulation by the sack to melt for scrap. The mint's answer, in 1982, is to gut the recipe. A new penny that is 97.5% zinc with only a thin copper plating, a fraction of a cent's worth of copper wrapped around a core of the cheapest metal the mint can strike. Zinc production starts at the West Point facility on January 7, 1982, and by October 21st, Denver has converted too. The switch buys the coin 3 decades, but zinc prices rise as well, and by the mid-2000s, the mint's own numbers show even the zinc penny's melt value creeping toward its face value. On April 17, 2007, the mint issues a federal rule making it a crime to melt pennies and nickels for their metal content. A fine of up to $10,000, up to 5 years in prison, and forfeiture of the coins themselves. A law written specifically because a 1 cent coin had become, quietly, worth more as scrap than as money. The cost of making the coin keeps climbing anyway. By fiscal year 2024, the penny alone accounts for 3.2 billion of the 5.61 billion coins the mint produces that year. 57% of the mint's entire circulating coin output spent on the denomination that loses the most money per unit of anyone in the lineup. In 2023, the mint strikes 4.1 billion cents at a cost of more than $179 million. In 2024, as production tightens, the bill still runs $85 million, even as the per-coin cost keeps rising by roughly 20% year over year. Canada solves the same equation 13 years earlier and simply stops. Canadian officials calculate that their penny costs about 1.6 cents to make against a face value of 1, a gap of 0.6 cents that runs the government roughly $11 million a year, and a private sector study puts the coin's total drag on the Canadian economy, production costs plus the extra handling time it forces on banks, retailers, and cashiers at $150 million in a single year, 2006. The Royal Canadian Mint stops distributing pennies to financial institutions in the fall of 2012. Canada rounds cash transactions to the nearest 5 cents and moves on. The United States watches this happen and keeps minting its own losing coin for another 13 years. For 3 decades, one organization works to keep that math running. Americans for Common Sense, founded in 1990 and based in Washington, is run by a lobbyist named Mark Weller, and its central financial backer is Jarden Zinc Products, the company that actually manufactures the blank zinc discs the mint strikes into pennies. Between 2006 and the first quarter of 2014 alone, Jarden spends $1.5 million lobbying Congress and the mint on 1 cent coin policy. In 2012 alone, Weller personally receives $340,000 from Jarden for that work. The organization's public argument, repeated in surveys and congressional testimony for 30 years, is that eliminating the penny would force retailers to round prices up rather than down, costing consumers as much as $600 million a year by one of the group's own commissioned estimates, a claim Weller offers with, by most outside accounts, remarkably little independent evidence behind it. For 3 decades, the argument works. Congress debates killing the penny in one form or another roughly once a decade, and roughly once a decade declines to do it. What finally breaks the standoff is not an economist or a mint official. On February 9, 2025, President Donald Trump announces on social media that he has directed the Treasury Department to stop producing new pennies, citing the coin's cost as wasteful government spending. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent later notes, dryly, that the dime is actually quite profitable for the government, which is not a defense Weller's coalition has ever managed to make for the cent. The mint places its final order of zinc blanks that spring, and by the middle of 2025, some regions are already reporting penny shortages at retail registers, forcing stores to round informally, months before any federal rounding law exists to guide them. Production winds down through the year. On November 12, 2025, at the Philadelphia Mint, Acting Director Christy McNally presides over what the Mint itself calls the historic ceremonial strike for the coin's final production run, marking 232 years of penny manufacturing. United States Treasurer Brandon Beach pulls the lever on the last one. While general production concludes today, McNally says, the penny's legacy lives on. The Mint estimates the shutdown saves roughly $56 million a year in material costs alone, a fraction of what the coin actually cost the country across 2 decades of losses, but the first year in 232 that the number does not climb. Weller's organization does not disband. It simply loses the argument it spent 35 years and $1.5 million in lobbying funds making. The zinc that makes up 97.5% of every penny struck after 1982 does not appear out of nothing either. Much of the world's zinc supply today comes through Peru, the second largest zinc producer on Earth, and one of its major sources is Cerro de Pasco, a mining town roughly 14,200 feet up in the Andes where the Volcan Campania Minera, backed by the commodities giant Glencore, runs an open-pit mine that sits directly beside the town it employs. A 2016 study found at least 2,500 children in the district suffering chronic heavy metal poisoning, with unsafe blood metal levels affecting up to 80% of the local population and fewer than a quarter of the district's 80,000 residents having access to treated drinking water. A 10-year-old named Aaron Blas died of leukemia. A 9-year-old named Esmeralda Martin suffered brain bleeding and partial paralysis and needed a bone marrow transplant that would cost more than $150,000 her family did not have. A 10-year-old girl named Sunmi lives with a diagnosed learning disability and daily nosebleeds tied to elevated lead in her blood. A 19-year-old named Maori reports chronic headaches she traces to the same contamination. Local officials recorded 4 deaths from cancer and metal poisoning in a single year in a district of 80,000 people, and Peruvian authorities eventually declared a 90-day health emergency in the district, later extended by 3 more months to examine 42 of the most critically affected children. The company's zinc sales that year alone topped $399 million, shipped out to South Korea, China, Canada, and the United States. Somewhere in that export chain sat the raw material for a coin that, by the time it reached an American's pocket, was worth exactly 1 cent and cost the government nearly 4 cents to make. Multiply that gap by the roughly 3.2 billion pennies the mint was still striking every year as recently as 2024, and the arithmetic becomes almost absurd. A government spending tens of millions of dollars annually to manufacture a coin whose primary destination, according to Treasury's own analysis, was a jar, a drawer, or a landfill rather than a cash register. Nobody in this story ever got rich off the penny itself. The people who died for its copper in Montana in 1917 and 1920 never held one of the coins their deaths helped produce and thought about the connection. The children in Cerro de Pasco poisoned by zinc dust have likely never spent an American cent in their lives. The only people who make real money off the coin's continued existence are the zinc-blank manufacturer that funded a Washington lobbying group and the lobbyist himself, who cashed 6-figure checks to keep a losing coin in production for 3 extra decades. Everyone else, the taxpayers who footed an annual bill of $179 million, the miners, the children, and ocean away, pays into a coin that was, by every honest measure, never worth what it cost to make. An estimated 114 billion pennies exist in the United States today, sitting in registers, car cup holders, and jars on dressers, most of them never spending again. Since 1793, the mint has struck more than 300 billion cents across 232 years of continuous production. The overwhelming majority of that total minted in just the last 100 years, as the country's economy scaled up around a coin nobody bothered to redesign out of the system. Americans throw away roughly $62 million in loose coins a year into landfills, sofa cushions, and washing machines, much of it pennies too small and too worthless to bother retrieving, according to waste recovery data compiled by the recycling firm Covanta. States and retailers are now working out, county by county and register by register, how to round cash transactions to the nearest nickel now that there are no more pennies coming to make change with, a logistical scramble that Congress spent 30 years refusing to plan for. In August 2026, nearly a year after the last penny left the Philadelphia Mint, the Senate finally passes the Common Sense Act to standardize the rounding rules retailers had spent months improvising on their own. Totals ending in 1, 2, 6, or 7 cents round down at the register. Totals ending in 3, 4, 8, or 9 cents round up, and the rule applies only to cash after tax, never to card transactions. The bill requires the Treasury to formally stop producing pennies within a year of enactment, a formality by the time it passes for a coin the mint already stopped making the previous November. Every penny already in someone's pocket, jar, or cash drawer stays legal tender indefinitely. The government simply never has to make another one. You probably have a jar of them somewhere in your house right now, dead weight collecting dust, worth exactly what they say on the front and nothing more, now frozen forever at whatever total sits in that jar. Most of that jar, statistically, has never been spent even once. Researchers have long noted that the majority of pennies struck in any given year disappear from circulation within weeks, dropped into exactly this kind of container, and never picked back up. They are still legal tender. Store clerks are still required to accept them, one at a time if you insist, even as the supply behind the register quietly runs out and the rounding rules take over at the till instead. Somewhere in Butte, Montana, an old mine shaft that swallowed 168 men in a single night in 1917 has been closed for decades, filled now with water instead of copper ore, its output long since spent and gone. Somewhere in the Peruvian Andes, an open pit still eats into a mountainside a few hundred feet from where families live, still producing zinc for a market that no longer needs pennies but still needs the metal for 100 other uses. And somewhere in a drawer in Philadelphia, the very last 1 cent coin the United States government ever struck for circulation sits in a case, worth precisely what it always was, 1 cent, after 232 years, 3 metal changes, at least 168 documented deaths in the supply chain behind it, and a final bill that outlived the coin itself. The next time you find one on a sidewalk, on a diner counter, or at the bottom of a couch cushion, you are looking at the tail end of a currency the government has formally decided is no longer worth making, and for once, you would be right to just leave it there.